Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. This is Deena Johnson from JFK Partners at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. Today's topic is Facing Your Fears, Part 1, and it's an introduction to the identification and treatment of anxiety in children and adolescents with Autism Spectrum Disorder. Part 2 of this series will be on June 10th, and the topic is Adaptations of Facing Your Fears for Telehealth, schools, or other age groups. Registration for that can be found at jfkpartners.org under Events. So feel free to type questions or comments in the chat box at any time. The questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. Please be sure to mute your microphones and your video so we can avoid any background noise. We are recording today's event and we'll archive it on the JFK Partners website. We have already posted the handout for today on this page where the archive will live. So you are welcome to print or save for future reference. Following the webinar, you will receive a link requesting an evaluation. And at that time, you can request a certificate of attendance in the evaluation. So now I'd like to turn it over to Judy Reaven.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Welcome. We're really excited to be here. Audrey and I are. Special welcome to our fellow Coloradoans who may be logged on and folks around the country, and also a special hello to our Canadian friends who we know are also listening today. As Deena said, this is part 1. So we are hoping that people who are on this webinar are folks who are maybe new to Facing Your Fears or new to CBT for anxiety. We are, as she said, going to be doing a part 2 where we're going to do more about adaptations of this program, and we'll talk more about that later. But we're really happy to have you with us. And what we'd like to do first is actually launch a little bit, just one poll, one question that helps us understand who's listening to us today. So Christine, I think, is going to be launching the poll. So it's just one question. And I'm going to take it too. And Christine, I'm going to let you tell us the results as soon as folks have had a chance to kind of complete it. And as she does that, I think I'll say just a tiny bit more about what we're hoping to review today. So as you can see, we want to talk a little bit about what anxiety might look like in children and teens with ASD, especially within a COVID lens. So you can see this is our COVID edition of Facing Your Fears, because we know all of us are impacted by what's been going on. And so we do want to talk a little bit about that and how you can tell when it's time to seek some intervention. And then we're going to go over just give you an overview of Facing Your Fears. And as Deena said, we're going to hope to be done with all of the content by about 11, and that saving the last 15 minutes for questions and answers.
And here's a quick look at your results, Judy.
I can see the results. All right, we have a lot of mental health professionals, non-mental health folks, and family members. Excellent. All right. Thanks so much for doing that, you all. All right, I'm just going to do a couple of introductory slides, and then I'm going to turn it over to Audrey to do the first part of this talk. No. There we go. First, we want to acknowledge our funding agencies over the years that have really helped support our research, and a lot of the program that we're going to be talking about is based on years of research. So just wanting to make sure folks know that, as well as children and families who participated in our programs over the, 15 years or so. We've learned so much from folks who participated with us, both clinically as well as research. So we always want to do a big shout out to our family. This is a long list of colleagues. I used to do this at the end of talks, but now I'm doing it at the beginning because I feel like they deserve credit for folks to kind of get a good list. These are the folks who participated in our clinical programs and clinical research programs. We have a whole nother group of folks who've helped us with our school-based programs and other projects, but just giving a shout out to the many team members that have helped inform our program. And one last slide here is that Audrey and I both receive royalties from the publication of Facing Your Fears. And it's something that you should know that is true for us. I do want to have one other comment about that. And you'll see as we go through today, we're going to talk about cognitive behavior therapy approaches for treating anxiety in kids on the spectrum. We will be talking about it from a Facing Your Fears lens. However, we recognize that there are folks listening in on this webinar who are from across the country who there may not be people doing Facing Your Fears there. And that's totally fine. This is really intended to inform you about cognitive behavior therapy in general. And even though we'll be giving you examples from our particular program, if you have other programs in your area that are doing good work, we want you to access those programs. So wanting to make sure that that's something that's kind of on your radar. We're happy to answer any other questions as we move along. So this is where I turn it over to Audrey for now, and we will take turns going back and forth. And go ahead, Audrey.
Okay, thank you. So Judy will take charge of the slides. So we're starting off here talking a little bit about common fears that children with ASD experience. And when we think about what the most common fears are, they typically involve fear-specific phobias, so fear of the dark, fear of loud noises, fear of flushing toilets. So the sensory concerns of children with ASD can really be exacerbated. And we also see generalized diffuse worries. So fear of making mistakes is a very common one. Fear of change can be hard. And then also social. So the social fears we see in this population may not be identical to typically developing children's. There may not necessarily be a fear of negative evaluation, but there could still be a lot of anxiety tied to engagement in social interactions. Naturally, that can be really hard. So in our next slide here, we'll talk a little bit about stressors. So these are just common stressors that really all of us are dealing with right now, but many of these are really exacerbated for children with ASD due to pre-existing anxiety. So kids may have worried about family health and safety prior to COVID. This could really be amplified right now. And some families have said that this fear about worry and health expands beyond just family members. It could be tied to restricted interests. So the health and safety of members of K-pop bands has come up for quite a few of the teens I work with. Health and safety of YouTube bloggers, things like that. So the other issue to really think about too is how change in instruction at school can really impact routine. And that is a big deal, not only for us as parents, but for our kids as well. So not only are we dealing with a change of routine in terms of not going to school, not going to work, but how does that manifest in terms of daily expectations? When those are changed, that can be really hard for all of us, but particularly for children with ASD. And we also have some kids who have this rigid belief system. Home is where I relax. Home is where I chill out. And now I'm expected to do homework and schoolwork at unpredictable times. That can be really hard, especially when kids are feeling like this is my time to relax. I'm not at school. And then those restricted interests can really come into play. I'm not going to have time to be able to log in my 5 hours a day of YouTube time or video game time. So I don't want to do work because I'm not going to have enough time to be able to engage in my special interests. And then as parents, we're all challenged by sudden onset of responsibilities, not only tied to work at home, but managing the academic demands of our kids. And a lot of parents are talking about fear of burnout. If their kids are only reliant on them as the teacher, the parent, the peer, in some ways a friend, how will that be able to be sustainable over time? What's interesting though is some families are saying that their anxiety looks a lot lower in their kids at this time, with academic and social demands maybe reduced. their kids may be less anxious. It may look really good at this time. And then the concern is, what will things look like when they re-enter school? What will things look like for us as a family when we're back in the community? So lots of complexity, but also lots of opportunity to really think about ways to support emotion regulation, anxiety at home. This can be an opportunity for, I think, all of us to really support our children to be successful managing the demands of their day-to-day life. Let's move on to some of the COVID-related fears that we hear about. Excessive fear about contamination can really come into play for many of our kids. So some of our kids already had contamination fears. Now these fears are being highlighted, exacerbated. Excessive hand washing can result in dryness, bleeding. Excessive fear tied to going outside can really further restrict a child's life. And then a lot of fear tied to starting work, being able to engage in academic work, and social participation. It's a new medium for many kids to have to engage in Google work groups. That can be really hard for many of our kids as well. And then those generalized worries can be really primary fear of parents dying. What will I do if I'm all on my own? Next slide. Judy, are you able to move on to the next slide? Okay, I'll just keep talking.
No, hold on, it's stuck.
Okay, no worries. When we think about anxiety and what this looks like in our children with ASD, sometimes, as we mentioned before, we're seeing amplification of the core deficits of ASD. So either more repetitive behaviors, more intense restricted interests. And when there's a comorbid intellectual disability, it can be really difficult to know what's behind some of these changes in behavior. So the child may not give voice to what the fear is, but we may see change in problem behavior, increase in repetitive behavior. And really, we want to be mindful of the fact that given that we know that there is a high comorbidity of anxiety in ASD and IDD, that this could be cause for some of the changes in behavior. So assessing change over time, change from baseline. When we move on to think about preschoolers, next slide, we'll also be thinking about how to really read what may be behind the child's behavior. So if we're seeing change in day-to-day behavior, sleep routines, adaptive behavior routines, such as toileting, we might want to be thinking, what could be behind this? Could there be worry or excessive anxiety that is contributing to change in behavior? And we also want to be mindful that acting out tantrum behavior, irritability, increased tantrums, crying could really be a byproduct of worry and anxiety. And change in routine can be really a critical component of that. So when kids are not engaging in the types of activities that they used to engage in naturally, which is taking place right now, not being able to go to school, not being able to be with peers, not being able to be on the playground, there can be an impact on that in terms of mood and worry. And physical symptoms as well. So stomach pain, headaches, sleep disorders. So we've talked a lot about symptoms of anxiety. There's so many different definitions for worry, fear, anxiety, but we're really not jumping to the conclusion that all kids are experiencing clinical levels of anxiety unless we're thinking about excessive, persistent, and interfering symptoms. So when worry is getting in the way of day-to-day activities and is taking over and further narrowing a person's life, we then consider, are these symptoms at the level that we might want to consider treatment? And that's when we're thinking about clinical disorders and the need for clinical treatment. So Connor Kearns does a fabulous job thinking through anxiety in the ASD population. And she really highlights this really nice framework for us to be considering when we're trying to differentiate symptoms that might be kind of there but subthreshold versus symptoms that might really be excessive and warranting treatment. And the first definition she has is the excessive nature, and really contextualizing the symptoms within the context of the child's developmental or cognitive functioning. So we think about there being a developmental approach to anxiety and fears with specific phobias, kind of the onset being younger, but when these fears may be either excessive or hitting hard at inappropriate developmental levels, we might want to be mindful of these symptoms and think carefully about whether or not treatment is needed. We also want to think about the impact. So when anxiety is taking over and impacting a child's ability to engage in schoolwork, whether that's online or with parents, whether it's getting in the way of social engagement, once again, online or with family members here, and impacting health and overall well-being, we would be concerned. And then the cognitive component, I think, is really interesting to think about because it doesn't always manifest in spoken worry. It could manifest in anticipation of events and desire to avoid protest behavior, really. So not just due to emotion regulation or sensory differences, but really the child's telling you through their behavior, I don't want to do this. I'm worried about what could happen. And they're telling you through distressed behavior. And the final point, the number 4, is really thinking that the anxiety symptoms that you're seeing are above and beyond those that we often see for children with ASD alone. So in other words, not just worry about sensory differences, not just worry about fear or change, but really above and beyond that. Tamara Chansky is a psychologist who writes a number of really amazing books. She has a website too. Some of her books are Freeing Your Child from Anxiety. And she created this formula that Judy and I really like, in part because it points out opportunities for intervention. So she describes the perfect formula for anxiety is when you overestimate threat to you. So there's that cognitive distortion component, and you underestimate your own ability to manage. And that could be managing your physiological response, or it could be managing your environment. And that can lead to anxiety. And the reason in part we like it because it points out opportunities for intervention. You can intervene on the cognitive component, the threat, and you can intervene also on a child's ability to manage their body. So that's a perfect lead into CBT. And I think Judy will take it from here for a little bit.
All right, thanks, Audrey. So we're going to talk a little bit about CBT. And I was remembering on the poll, it sounds like there's a good chunk of folks that are family members as well as non-mental health people. But I also saw there was a significant group that were mental health folks. So bear with me while I explain a little bit about CBT for those of you where this might be familiar. CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, is the treatment of choice for anxiety. Okay. And if you look to the right, and you'll see the diagram that says what you think, what you do, and how you feel. Folks who think about CBT, think about the connection between each of those areas and how they influence people's behavior. When you look at CBT in the general population, so people without autism, it is absolutely the treatment of choice. And we see that it is the most effective in that children in the general pediatric population do show significant reductions in anxiety following participation in this intervention. So some of you may be saying, okay, so what is CBT? So CBT is comprised of those core components that we have on the slide. Let me just explain them very briefly, and then I'll give you a couple of examples, and then we'll show you how we explain these somewhat abstract concepts to our population. So psychoed and graded exposure are really the two kind of key components to be thinking about for treatment of anxiety. Psychoed is comprised of the two bullets that are right below it, or really three, I suppose. somatic management, cognitive restructuring, and problem solving. So somatic management refers to the ability to manage your body's reaction to anxiety, okay? So we all have physical responses. There's nothing unique about our population. We all experience it as human beings. And part of what we teach people is how to manage that feeling and in some cases, how to tolerate it. Cognitive restructuring in the work that we do isn't kind of technically cognitive restructuring. So folks who are really experienced in CBT and a general population might use this particular approach. For us, what we do is we pay attention to what people are telling themselves, and we help people understand the connection between thoughts, feelings, and behavior. We also use an approach called, we help individuals generate helpful thoughts instead of what might be considered automatic negative thoughts or attention to threat. And you'll see some examples there to really try to help folks have a different narrative inside your head about how things might turn out. So those two bullets, somatic management, cognitive restructuring, are all parts of psychoed, as well as kind of explaining what anxiety is. Problem solving is really helping people make an informed choice between a couple of different options, kind of weighing the cost benefit. Graded exposure is bolded, and the reason it's bolded is because research is telling us that facing your fears, which is what graded exposure is, doing the thing that you are afraid of, is probably the most critical component of anxiety intervention. Relapse prevention refers to helping people understand once they leave intervention that symptoms might return. That's a natural part of human experience. And really talking them through how do you want to handle it when the symptoms might return? What are your strategies? What are your approaches? So that it doesn't feel like a big sort of shock, I guess, when they might experience some anxiety in the future. Here's an example of just a diagram, again, for folks who may be new to CBT, to kind of show you how we want to think about this connection between physical feelings, thoughts, and behavior. So if you look at the trigger, so this is a conceptualization of a child that might have separation anxiety, okay? So they don't want their parent to go to another part of the house. And we certainly have seen this a number of times. Parent might go upstairs, might go downstairs, and the child doesn't want their parent to do that. And in some cases might follow you into the bathroom. Hopefully you are shutting the door and not allowing that, but it does happen, right? So that's the trigger. And then you can see physical feelings, thoughts, and behavior are all sort of activated. So it's in no particular order. So I'm not suggesting it's always thoughts, then physical feelings, then behavior. It's really kind of an interaction of all three. But thoughts that a child might have if they really do have separation anxiety, which would be an unrealistic set of thoughts, might be something bad is going to happen to me if my mom goes downstairs. Something bad might happen to them if I'm not with them, if they're not in my sight. So that might be some of the thoughts that you might have. So I only am okay if I'm with my parents. The set of physical feelings someone might have in this circumstance, and the truth is you'd have these sort of set of physical feelings almost regardless of what you might be anxious of, because they're kind of universals. But it might be that you're sweating, or that you feel hot, or you have a dry mouth, or you have a headache or stomach ache, or any amount of sort of physical feelings, shakiness. So you've got these sort of thoughts, and you've got this physical set of feelings, and it's thought that the combination of what you tell yourself and how your body feels leads to behavior. And if you have both sets, the behavior you might observe in someone who has separation anxiety might be, I'm not going to let you separate from me, so I'm going to cling to you, I'm going to chase you, I'm going to find you, I'm going to make sure I am with you, okay? So following your parent around the house and so on. The part of the reason why we also like to show this diagram is because it shows you where we want to intervene. So if you look at the triangle, it shows you we want to intervene with thoughts. So maybe think something different. Instead of something bad's going to happen to me, you might want to help kids think about something else. I'll be okay if my mom goes downstairs, or she uses the bathroom, I'll be fine. Physical feelings, it's back to the somatic management. So how do we want to manage our body's reaction to anxiety? So we we intervene with that space. And then the last is behavior. So you can see all of that behavior is geared towards avoiding the separation. So if you're remembering what I said before, which is graded exposure is the most critical piece of intervention, it means you have to do the thing that you're afraid of. So instead of avoiding the separation, in fact, what an intervention would do would be to handle a separation. Okay, and you'll see more about this as we move on. So here, actually, this is a good segue into graded exposure. So as I've been saying, graded exposure, and the graded word, so exposure means doing the thing that you're afraid of. Graded means doing it a little at a time. And the reason that we do a lot of graded exposure for kids on the spectrum is because we feel like it makes treatment easier to do. So that, I mean, it's been an important piece of how we conceptualized this component for folks on the spectrum. Okay, so what do we know about CBT for anxiety and ASD? Like what's already been done? And the truth is, this is probably just a handful of all the studies that are out there. I get so impressed with our colleagues really around the world who are doing a lot of really good work. And it's hard to keep up, actually, in terms of all the programs that are out there. But what's been happening so far is that a lot of folks have been doing individual treatments. Kind of modifying Coping Cat and some other kinds of programs that are out there for kids on the spectrum. Other groups, like our group, has chosen to do a group intervention, and we'll talk a little bit more about why we prefer to do a group. Some folks have done a combination of individual plus group interventions, but importantly, you should know that the focus, at least in the research, has really truly been on school-age kids. So by school-aged, I mean maybe that 7 to 14 age group. There are studies of folks that are working with teens. We've done some work with teens. There are a few more studies that are working with kids that are preschoolers, but by and large, the bulk of the research to date has really been on this kind of school-age population and in clinic settings. Here's an example of some of the programs around the country focused specifically on anxiety. And again, there are probably more that I haven't even addressed. And when we are done with all of this, if folks wanted to shout out some programs that you feel like are important for the group to know, please do that in the chat. Because as I said, we're not saying, our program, Facing Your Fears, is somehow the only way to get CBT for anxiety in autism. You can get it a lot of different ways, actually. So folks have modified the Coping Cat program, modified Cool Kids, a program out of Australia. Jeff Wood has done a ton of work in adapting his original program, Building Confidence, but also for kids on the spectrum, called Biaka, and that's he's based at UCLA. And then there are programs like ours that specifically sort of started at the beginning and wanted to have a treatment program for kids on the spectrum. So the Tony Atwood program, again, out of Australia, Susan White's program called Massey, and then the Facing Your Fears. And again, as I said, there are others. But the nice common thread about all of these programs is that they're all inclusive of psychoeducation and graded exposure. So when, at least for us, when we started developing the Facing Your Fears program, and I think for folks who had a program that was developed in the general population and wanted to apply it to kids on the spectrum, folks realized that you have to do some kind of modifications to make CBT accessible. At least for us, when Audrey and I would first kind of get started with Facing Your Fears, we realized that the content of some general CBT programs was perhaps too abstract and language-based for our population, and we needed to be more concrete and more linguistically appropriate. So you will see a lot of the adaptations, not just in our program, but in other programs for kids on the spectrum, include a lot of visual structure and support. We value kids' special interests. We want to hear about them, and we want to find a way to incorporate them into the intervention. We have a strong value of having parents involved in our programs. And I think a lot of programs also have parent involvement. Ours, I guess I would say, is probably fully integrated in that we have parents come every time. We have a specific curriculum for parents, and we'll talk about that later as we move through. As I said, a lot of the programs for kids on the spectrum do reduce the demands for abstract language and are more concrete, and intentionally so. And then really trying to identify strategies for generalization. So I would say these are the kinds of common modifications that you'd see across a lot of different kinds of programs. Now I'm going to shift over to sort of the Facing Your Fears program and talk a little bit about some things maybe unique to us. So our program, the original Facing Your Fears program, is a clinic-based program for kids 8 to 14. And in part 2, you're going to hear all the different ways that we've adapted it for different age groups and different contexts. But for right now, I'm just going to go over the clinic-based program. It's 14 weeks, an hour and a half each time. Again, this is actually quite in line with many of the other programs that I showed you. A lot of folks have this kind of duration of clinic-based programs. Short-term, I mean, we want them to be short-term. For us, the modality is varied. We have parents and kids, as I said, come every time. We have sometimes when when everyone is there, we might have a large group where everybody's in the same room at the same time, and we're going to have 4 to 5 families. So if you think about 4 to 5 families plus parents, plus inclusive of parents and inclusive of facilitators, it could be a large group. But we do have large group activities. We have parents alone sometimes and children alone, so they're having simultaneous groups. And then sometimes we have them working in dyads or triads on specific tasks. First 7 weeks is a lot of focus on psychoed, as I said earlier. So we want to define what makes people anxious, like what is anxiety anyway? What is your body doing when you feel anxious? And then thinking about tools. So a lot of CBT programs are all about tools. What can you do to manage your body? What can you do to manage your thoughts? What can you do to manage your strong emotions? And then, of course, we introduce the idea of graded exposure. Although the truth is, the program's called Facing Your Fears, so our kids are pretty savvy. They pretty early on figure out that they're going to have to do something they don't want to do because of the name of the group. Second 7 weeks is all about having kids actually face fears, and we encourage it in group, so right in front of us, and we also encourage families to do what we call exposure practice at home. We use a lot of videos, self-modeling, and I'll give you just a little taste of some of that as part of that second 7 weeks. And then we do offer a booster session. So remembering a core component of CBT is relapse prevention. So in order to think about relapse prevention, you want to have a booster where you remind kids of their strategies 4 or 6 weeks after you've last seen them and say, hey, how's it going now? Now that we haven't seen you, give us a feel for what has come up for you, and then a reminder on things that had worked for them in the past. So I showed you the slide earlier about modifications for Facing Your Fears, for other CBT programs. Here's some modifications kind of that are, I don't know if they're unique to our program, but at least ones that we've used in our program. And I'll give you some examples in just a minute. We do a lot of multiple choice lists and written worksheets. So I'm sure that you all would know. If I could ask you, I'm not going to do a poll, but if I said, what do you think happens if I said to a group of kids with ASD, hey, like, do you know why you're here? Are you, this is an anxiety group. Like, are you anxious? Tell me about your anxiety. If we did that, I think you all would know what would happen. Some of our guys would say, I'm not anxious. That's not me. Wrong group. That's just not part of my experience. So part of what we have to do is, instead of asking a lot of open-ended questions, we do provide kids with a lot of worksheets, multiple choice lists, so that they can look at the options and then make kind of an informed choice. We use a lot of positive rewards, tokens, just like a lot of other programs. As I said before, we use a lot of video modeling to show what kids are. Mostly the ones I like the best are the ones where we have little videos of kids facing fears and they watch other kids face fears, which we really feel like is really powerful. We try to use a variety of activities. We do a bunch of worksheets. I mean, we just do, but we also try to have options for drawing. You'll see we have a play-based activity. We absolutely want to focus on our kids' strengths and talents. You know, I think the way that Audrey and I conceptualize anxiety is it's really just this obstacle in people's path. which it is for most of us really, and that our job is to eliminate this obstacle. So if you can imagine like a roadblock, that's what we want to do, is get it out of there so that our kids can kind of be who they want to be and express themselves how they want to express themselves and show off their talents and strengths in a way that sometimes if you're very anxious, it doesn't allow you to do so. A decent amount of repetition and practice is part of what we do because we feel like it helps some of the common strategies stick. And as I've said before, we do have an integrated parent curriculum that talks about psychoed, directly addresses how to help families do graded exposure practice at home. And we do talk directly about parental anxiety and style. All right, we'll get into the nuts and bolts here for just a minute. Again, this is kind of a broad overview, really intended as an introduction. So it's comprised of two core components, right? Psychoed and graded exposure. So if we're going to start with psychoed, what are the important parts that we have to think about? Well, as I said, we have to start thinking about what is contributing, what are the situations that even contribute to being anxious. So this is done in conjunction with families where we say, what do you think it is for your kids? Is it the dark? Is it social interaction? Is it a specific phobia? Is it loud noises? Is it change? You know, what is it? And what do you think is happening for your child? And we want the kids to be able to say, what do they notice about themselves in their bodies? Some kids may not notice anything, but some kids really do notice some things. And so it's really important for us to have that dialogue, even if at the beginning our guys aren't on board. Totally fine. So you might be thinking, this is never going to work for my kid, or this is never going to work for someone I know. And what I would say to you is, many of the kids that we meet on day one are in a place where they're not even sure why they're in group. They don't feel like they have anxiety. And our job is to not convince, that's not what we want to do, but to really kind of explain what is getting in somebody's way. Because as I said, we want people to feel like they can be who they want to be and not be burdened really by anxious feelings. So here's an example of one of the worksheets. This came actually not from the clinic-based program. So folks who might know the clinic-based program, this is not going to look familiar to you. This is actually from our school-based program, which we're going to talk about in more detail in 2 weeks. But we like the worksheets from this program, and so that's why we're showing it to you. But you can see the title is "Everybody Worries and Gets Upset Sometimes." That's a key tenet of how we view this. This is not about somehow our kids have autism and we're adding one more thing to their plate. We are saying this is universal. This is, we all experience anxiety and our kids are no different. And these are some examples of what somebody might experience. You can see some of these are school-based. They may not all be relevant for some folks who aren't in school right now, but if you do the open-ended question and say, what do you think makes you anxious? We might get blank stares. If we show our kids worksheets like this, there might be more of a, oh, okay. So maybe it's being the last student to finish something. Maybe it's that my teacher's correcting my work. Maybe it's, I really don't like loud noises, you know, that sort of thing. So that's kind of how we've used the visual supports to get at some complex questions. We also have a worksheet, I didn't include it here, but one that also is a checklist of physical symptoms. So as I said, we want our kids to be able to identify what is happening inside their bodies. This is a long process. And many of us sometimes don't know what's happening inside our body or to recognize it as anxiety. But we have a checklist of, you know, sweatiness, feeling warm, feeling sick, that sort of thing, so that they can begin to get used to what their bodies might feel like. Okay, so after we've done some of that, we're still in psychoed. And what we like to do is kind of establish this framework for how anxiety can interfere with your life. And I feel like this is relevant for all of us, honestly. And that is that many of us may spend a lot of time doing behaviors that are in response to our anxiety or worrying. And I'm going to show you some worksheets here in a second. And the point here is to communicate to our kids, you don't have to be so managed by your worry. You don't have to kind of give into it so much. You might find a way, and that's what externalizing means, to separate out the set of anxious symptoms from who you are as a person. And if you can separate them out, you are not the sum total of your anxiety. You are a unique, creative, wonderful, interesting person who maybe also has anxiety in addition to those things. And our job as your therapists, your parents, your caregivers, your teachers, your speech pathologists are to help you beat up on your anxiety so that you can have more control and to help you figure out ways to manage it. And that's why we're so focused on emphasizing strengths, that it's not just that our kids are anxious, but they're wonderful, interesting, engaging people who happen to have anxiety that is hard to manage. So this next series of worksheets is all about how we convey a complex concept, which is time. How much time do you spend worrying? And we do it by showing you a couple of different kids. So again, this is from the school-based program. In this worksheet, you see that Michael worries about a lot of things. He spends a lot of time, a lot of his time at school worrying or being upset. You can see there's a whole range of things he's upset about: germs, bugs, storms, being late, using the public bathroom, taking tests, and so on. There is a meter here where it says low, medium, and high. He has a lot of high intensity fears. And we try to, I really like this concept, which is how much of your day does worry take? And it's a circle, and the dark spaces indicate that Michael spends so much of his time worrying, he hardly has any time left for fun. And then if you go to the right panel, we have already drawn it for the kids so that they can see Michael's having a hard time. He spends almost all of his day worrying, which is a bummer for Michael, right? Then we contrast it with Sophia, who worries a little bit about taking tests. You can see there's only a couple things that are on her in her thought bubbles: taking tests and being late. Her worries are low intensity, and she's got way more time to have fun and spends a little less time worrying. And then we say to the kids, show us how much time you think Sophia's worrying. And my guess is you all are looking at this and you're saying, oh, I think it's just a little. So maybe one of the two smaller circles that you see. And then we have someone in the middle. So we have Tyrone, who is worried about a few things. He has a medium amount of time worrying, and a lot of his day, or I would say half of his day-ish, is spent worrying. And then we say, again, how much worrying time do you think Tyrone spends? And then we say, now it's your turn. And you can see, I think, the reason why we've set it up this way, because we want our kids to have this mindset of, oh, worrying is wasted time. Now I get it. Because I know families and lots of folks actually are concerned about, well, will our kids have buy-in to this kind of approach? And again, we're not trying to convince anybody of anything, but we are really trying to do a little education about this is, we're sorry that this set of symptoms has to rule you or interfere with you so much. And so we want to convey it and also give them a little bit of an idea that it doesn't always have to be this way. So then our kids will draw a line wherever they feel like is reflecting how much time they think they spend worrying. I will say one thing, again, if some of you are looking at this and saying, my child is never going to admit to feeling anxious, or the student I'm working with is never going to admit to feeling anxious. Again, we're not trying to say the adult opinion is the correct opinion. We are just trying to start a dialogue about, let's hear what our kids think, let's hear what we think, and see if we can have some common understanding about how much time folks spend worrying. We also do this externalizing activity. So as I said, we separate out the person from the problem. A lot of other programs might do something similar to this. This is something along the lines for the mental health folks who are listening. This might sound similar if you're familiar with narrative therapy kinds of approaches, solution-oriented approaches. But what we do is we say, imagine your worry, and imagine it's in the form of a bug. What do you think it would look like? What would you want to call it? And we had someone who did it out of Play-Doh, and I don't know if you can see it, but he called it Stupid Spider. And then we say, imagine a helper bug. So again, it's this idea of you have control. You can take control over your symptoms. What would it look like? And what would you want to call it? So this person, same person, said Super Kid. And I love that he went back and forth between using the same colors of Play-Doh to sort of transform his worry into the helper bug. And then, of course, if you've got a helper bug and a worry bug, you have nothing left to do but to squash your worry. And that is absolutely the tone that we want to take. So if you can imagine what it means to squash your worry, it means to take control of it. And that's part of this activity, is to help kids say, you don't have to be ruled by this. You can really manage some of this in your life. Okay, so we've externalized worry. We've spent some time talking about how much time you spend worrying. And then we have to do some more psychoed, right? We have to manage our minds and manage our bodies. So we do talk about concepts of false alarms. So what is a false alarm kind of experience? Something more irrationally based is one way to think about that. We do want to convey the sense that your anxiety, this is true for all of us, that anxiety will pass, and that we all as human beings can tolerate that distress in our bodies. We do want to spend some time thinking about managing strong emotions. So I'll show you how we do that in a sec. And then we have the cognitive part. So I talked about cognitive restructuring, but we think about it as active minds versus helpful thoughts, and then making the connection between thoughts, body, and behavior. So we do measuring anxiety. And again, there are other programs that are out there. This is from some of our very, very first programs. We call it a stressometer. You can see it's very simple. Lots of folks use stoplight systems these days. So I'm not suggesting there's something special about this. It's green, yellow, red. You can understand that the higher you go on the little bead, it means the more upset or anxious you might be. The goal for all of us, I think, is to stay in green, although human experience would tell us we all spend time in red sometimes, and that's okay. We just don't want to hurt anybody or hurt ourselves when we're in red. Here's a little small pocket version of the stressometer. You probably can't tell, but it's laminated and it's small, and it kind of is just a smaller representation, but at the same concept. But as I said, there are other programs out there, the incredible 5-point scale, zones of regulation, and again, there are probably others. I'm not saying you have to do anything different than what you're already doing if you have a program like this, but the key is, it is important for us to know how high we are, how upset we might be, because it does lead to, well, what are we going to do when we're upset? So what am I going to do when I'm in red? I have a list of strategies. What do we want our kids to do when they're in red? Because again, you don't want it to take over. And because this is part of human experience to manage your emotions. Some of us spend a lifetime trying to figure this out. Okay, other ways to help manage your body's reaction. You can see this is a slide with a lot of different options. And again, there's a lot more on here. We don't do it as part of our specific program, but people do yoga, people do more mindfulness, people do other kinds of breathing. You can see there's square breathing there. You can use a visual cue to smell the flowers, blow out the candle. The Hoberman sphere in the right-hand corner is something we use quite a bit in groups where I'm sure you've seen it. It expands and then it gets smaller. And when kids have that visual of breathing in and then breathing out, if they can map it onto someone going in and out like that with the sphere. So there's lots of different ways. Some of our guys do have trouble coordinating breathing, honestly. And so we don't want to over focus on it. Sometimes it's just important to notice your breath as opposed to focus on that has to be somehow deep breathing. All right, so that was the somatic management part. Then we're paying attention to our thoughts. And this is one that's COVID related that we wondered if this might resonate with folks. So an active mind is that your mind sort of takes on a life of its own, and you're faced with a situation of being worried about COVID, as many of us are. But if you were in elementary school or middle school, you might have some of these thoughts. This pandemic will never end. My parents are definitely going to die. I never have enough time to have fun. School takes forever. I'll never see my friends. You can see the kind of dramatic, and I'm using that word, and I'm not really trying to even minimize the issues with COVID. That's not what I'm trying to say. But some of our folks might take it to the nth degree, and where it's kind of an all or nothing, black or white kind of thinking. And then there's the little yellow square that says, do you think thinking these thoughts will make this kid feel better or worse? And my guess is you are saying to yourself, thinking those thoughts nonstop would make somebody feel bad, would make you feel worse, okay? So some of the things we want you to be thinking about is, okay, when when a young person has these thoughts, who do they share them with? Do they share them with their family, friends? When can you share them? Kind of a sense about just how to think about those. But also, parents may have active mind. We all do actually have active minds kinds of thoughts. And from a parent perspective, when is the time to share your own active mind thoughts with your kids? And many of us know that we got to balance that. I'm the grown-up here, sadly, and part of my job is to manage balancing reassurance with my kids, with my own anxiety, and I might need to share my own anxious red thoughts with my friends or my partner, and not necessarily with my kid, like, me too, I don't think this pandemic is ever going to end. That doesn't take you anyplace positive usually. And I will also just draw your attention to the different kinds of thoughts that people can have. So if you look at the ones on the left-hand side, pandemic will never end, my parents are going to die, and contrast it with, I'll never see my friends again, I never have enough time. Think about those, and I'm going to show you the the helpful thoughts slide, which is some of the helpful thoughts on the right-hand side are actually kind of problem solving. So if I don't think I'm going to actually ever get to see my friends, problem solving kind of thought might be, oh, okay, well, I guess I could see my friends through FaceTime. Or I'll never have enough time for fun, I guess I can take a break after I get some work done. Contrast it with the right-hand or left-hand side, whereas the worrying about COVID won't make it go away. That really is kind of a helpful thought. You don't have to do anything other than to just kind of recognize that worrying doesn't make it better. And it probably makes it worse, and it won't prevent you from getting COVID if you worry about it. So that's an important distinction here. All right, components of graded exposure. We've talked about that a little bit here, where we want to identify what anxious symptoms are getting in the way. You have to develop a ladder. We call them hierarchies, fear ladders, where you have the least anxiety provoking all the way to the most, because as we said, it's graded, which means you start with sort of small steps towards facing fears, and you do them a little at a time, okay? So here's a couple of examples of fear hierarchies. One is one that we've used back in the day when people actually went to restaurants, which we'll get there again, I know, but lots of our kids shut down and won't talk to strangers. And so the first example, the first step might be just telling your parent what you want to order. Next step might be that you point to the food that you want when the waiter comes around. Maybe you then give a 1 to 2 word response. You then speak in full sentences to make your request, and then you're doing it all by yourself. Okay, so that would be an example of a fear hierarchy. If you wanted to have one during COVID times, this is what it might look like. And this has happened for a number of our kids, and Audrey pulled this one together. So some of our guys didn't want to be online during the online schooling. So maybe the first step might be turning the camera on and appearing on the video. Another one might be you're typing a comment in the chat feature. Another step might be where you have to ask or answer a question in a small group. Then you have to give a brief response when asked a question by a teacher. So that's a little more pressure. Sending a comment to a peer sometimes can be anxiety provoking. And then finally texting a peer. So you can see it starts small and works its way up. And again, this kind of approach you can do for really any kind of fear. You just have to kind of know what kids are avoiding. And you can see it's all about not avoiding. It's all about doing the thing that you're afraid of. So I'm going to turn this back over to Audrey. We have just a few more slides about the parent piece, and then we'll be ready to take questions.
So we view the parent component as really critical. As Judy talked earlier in the presentation about what might be unique about our program, I do believe the parent component is really unique. As Judy shared, parents come every week. Why do we feel this is important? The obvious reason: parents are the key support for children with ASD across the lifespan. And parent support, generalization, Anxiety is bidirectional. If your child is anxious, you can get anxious. If you're anxious, your child can get anxious. So it's really important to come up with a system that really can be implemented not only in the clinic, but at home, in school, in the community. We also find that anxiety can be very isolating, and many of our families have struggled with this. How do you raise a child not only with ASD, but with this co-occurring anxiety? And support comes in many places, but often from people who really truly understand, and that's other parents. We also find that many of the anxiety symptoms we see in our children with ASD are somewhat universal. You're not the only one if you have a child who has a fear of flushing toilets. You're not the only one if your child does not want to be in the dark. So some of the opportunities to share can be very powerful. And then also what we find is very useful is really thinking through supports tied to building a child's resilience, building their own ability to cope. Oftentimes parents will tell us that their children kind of pull from them this behavior where as parents they take over and they manage their children's anxiety. And what that does over time is it teaches kids that they're not able to manage their own anxiety, that other people, such as teachers, parents, have to kind of take over. And that's not the message we want to send. We want to send the message that you're competent, you're brave, and you can do it. And that does take some practice to be able to do. We also talk a lot about parenting anxiety and style, because that's at the heart of parenting a child with anxiety. You're faced with tough decisions. When do you push them and when do you kind of pull back and protect? And having these discussions with other parents can be very powerful. We also just want to put out there some just common strategies that we all probably are familiar with, but can rely upon in this time of need here. Daily routines can be very powerful in implementing and practicing coping approaches, such as helpful thoughts, deep breathing. Kids will not use deep breathing when they're in the red zone if that's not part of a daily routine where it's practiced and inherently positive. So thinking about this time as a time to really build coping routines, I think can be very powerful. And then creating lists of distractions. There's been a lot of information about this in the media. Practicing self-compassion and gratitude, really important not only for our kids, but for us as parents. And thinking about issues of control. Like Judy said, this is an epidemic that is not going away anytime soon, but we don't want it to take over too much. And when it begins to take over and children become overwrought with emotion and fear, we really want to identify what can you take over, what can you control, and what can you not. Comedy, essential, and even poking fun of our own anxiety, poking fun of our worries and our coping. And then news. This is a real challenge, but what our field has taught us through other devastating disasters is you have to be very mindful of how much news you put out there. Too much news can be damaging and can be traumatizing for adults and for kids alike. So limiting that, not restricting, but limiting. And then another bonus about what's happening today, there are so many websites and apps that are freely available to all of us and are providing opportunities for us to be able to access meditation, breathing, tracking anxiety. Feel free to put some of those in the chat because they really can be very helpful. This slide just showcases a few of the articles over the years that our group has put out there tied to CBT, with the earliest study that Judy and our colleague Susan Hepburn published, which was a case study that really prompted and led to a lot of work over the past 15 years. So there is, to be very clear, of very strong evidence base for this work. And I think that's important to highlight because as a parent, you're faced with decisions and choices. What do I do? And we really are sharing a treatment that has been very well researched and has proven to be effective. Take-home points: treatment for anxiety is thinking very carefully about ways to calm your body, the somatic management approach, manage your cognitions, manage your mind, and then face fears. Get to green. Sorry, I went too quickly there. So getting to green is pulling your mind and your body's reaction to that green zone. As Judy shared, we all spend time in red. The goal is not to never be in red. The goal is to be able to empower our kids to be able to manage that anxiety so that they know that they can do it, not that they have to rely on others to manage their anxiety. And then the heart of change is facing fears a little bit at a time. We are so excited to talk to you again in 2 weeks' time. We have worked on a telehealth delivery, and we have a study that is the lead author is our colleague Susan Hepburn, and it's a study that we did several years ago, actually, that adapted the Facing Your Fears program for delivery via telehealth. And we conducted a number of groups via telehealth, and we published that. I have to look in my notes. I wrote that down, 2016. So lead author, Susan Hepburn, and we have further kind of adapted for delivery via telehealth, and we're happy to share information about that. As Judy mentioned, we've also adapted for school. So Judy is the principal investigator of a HRSA-funded project, and we have been conducting research in our local schools for the past 3 years. And that has also kind of converted to telehealth in the past couple of months. So we can talk a little bit about that. And then we have also worked to adapt CBT for teens with IDD as well. And very excited to share with you possibilities because there is great potential for effective treatment for teens or youth with ASD and IDD in general. They are able to make use of cognitive and somatic management approaches, and we would like to highlight that. Okay, we're running right up to the wire here at 11:05. We see that there are a number of questions already out there in the chat. So maybe what we can do is address those. Thank you to Carol, who provided some different apps. Awesome to see that. Let's go up, and Judy and I will kind of try and take these both. Let's see. I'll try and take on the first one and then maybe hand it over to Judy. So it looks like, does that sound okay, Judy?
Yep, go for it.
Let's see. Do you notice a difference in the efficacy of FYF interventions or even more globally CBT when conducted in clinical settings versus in home settings? Okay, great question. As a parent myself during COVID and talking to other parents, the tools that I have used in the classroom are not working with the same efficacy at home to manage fears and anxiety. Have you seen this? If so, how do you handle it? This is a great question because I think it speaks to the issue of generalization. And we talked a little bit about that. Sometimes kids will lock into routines and believe they can only use these approaches or these strategies in one setting as opposed to practicing and implementing in many different settings. So sometimes it takes different people in different settings. Sometimes it takes similar approaches and visualizing and then just creating new routines to practice. I'm not familiar with the research, and maybe Judy can speak to this, as to whether or not there's a study that is a comparison study specifically tied to home-based versus clinic-based. I'm not sure, so she can take it from here, but I will highlight the fact that don't give up. These approaches take practice, they take creativity, and you're most likely fighting against rigidity here. Judy, can you kind of—
Absolutely, yeah. I agree with everything Audrey just said. In terms of the research, you know, I'm not aware of it with kids with ASD. I am aware of programs called parent-led programs that Kathy Cresswell in the UK is a big leader in that area, which is kind of a self-help manual for parents to deliver the intervention themselves with some therapist assistance. And so that's probably the closest that I can think of in terms of interventions happening in the home. And those are showing some nice results. In fact, we want to do something like that ourselves and need to get funded to do that. But so that's a really great question. Let me just go right to the next question, which is along the same lines. Has this intervention or treatment been found to be any less effective when delivered in one-on-one as compared to group? That's a really great question. What I would say to you is a couple things. One, in the general literature, we know that individual and group therapy for anxiety in kids on the spectrum is fairly equivalent, so that there aren't any big differences. We know logistically that from a clinician perspective, it can be hard to run groups. You have to have families whose schedules are all on the same wavelength. You have to have therapists who are all on the same wavelength. Some kids do better individually than they do in a group, to be honest with you. And so those are all the things you have to think about if you're going to run a group. On the other hand, we love doing groups, so that we love the benefits of families talking with each other and for kids meeting each other and developing connections with them. We do have a kind of modified, individually delivered version of Facing Your Fears. Many of our students do it individually. Audrey and I we do it ourselves with some of the clients that we work with. So yeah, there isn't anything magical about that it has to be in a group, but you just have to be aware of some of the things you gain by being in a group versus some of the things you gain by doing it individually. So some kids really do work well individually because there may be some complexities about their presentation that work well. But if part of the question is, can we adapt it for individual delivery? The answer is yes.
And sometimes also we try individual first to kind of prep a child to be able to participate fully in a group. So sometimes if there are behavior management problems, they need to have a special behavior plan and supports to set them up for success for the group. And then conversely, after some kids complete group, it might mean that they have a range of other worries that weren't specifically tackled in group that might be a little bit idiosyncratic and might require some extra support over time. So sometimes kids go individual, group, individual, and vice versa. It looks like Linda is asking a question tied to what should you do if your child doesn't believe you when you tell them that things will get better or that bugs won't hurt them? That's a great question. I'll have to see what Judy says. What I would say about that is our job is not to necessarily convince children that their worry is unmerited. And we really try and be very careful with our language. We don't want to give false reassurances. And that's very important. We want children to trust us. And so there is a probability that people will get sick. So we don't want to give false reassurances. No, your parents will never get sick. No, everyone will always be fine. No, bugs will never hurt you. Because that's not true. It's simply not true. We do want to put a face of realism on. And often we can do so by fighting fear with facts. So we talk a lot about probability, and we don't want fear, a small probability event, to blossom into a higher probability event than it really is. We also then want to focus on the management issues tied to managing your mind and managing your body. So if you're only targeting the cognitive component, you're missing out on opportunities to manage the body's reaction. And then the exposure component comes into play as well. What is the child avoiding? And how can you support the shift in cognition through behavioral exposure? So oftentimes that shift will take place after a child has been able to be successfully exposed to situations like bugs over time and be able to maintain safety. Anything you would add to that, Judy?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the key is we don't want to, I like, Audrey's about really trying to help our kids see facts. So sometimes just sharing simple facts they may not know, and that sometimes can be really helpful. I try not to get into a debate with our kids. I always lose every time because outthink us. They come up with stuff that I haven't thought about. So I try to avoid the debates, but rather think about the uselessness of worry, the sort of repetitive parts of, but what if, because it doesn't solve anything unless it's going to lead towards, here's what I'm going to do differently in my life to make sure I'm safe. That's within reason. That repetitive spin that many of us can get into just doesn't serve a purpose. And the only other thing I would add is communicating that the distress or the uncomfortable feeling that we all have when we feel anxious, that we can all tolerate that too, that it feels kind of crummy in our bodies, but we can handle that. And so we do talk about some distress tolerance. So it's sort of less about convincing and more about just trying to think about the kind of wasted nature of the worry and to kind of go on and live your life. Audrey, did you want to take that next one around program with comorbidities? I don't know if there's...
Yeah, we'll talk more at the
next
session. Yeah, we'll talk more at the next session. But what I would say about that is creating routines for people with intellectual disability tied to deep breathing and a very brief mantra. So we're not talking about challenging cognitions. We're thinking about creating what we would think about as a helpful thought. I can do it. I'm brave. I can handle it. And we have seen really nice outcomes. So people with intellectual disability are able to manage their bodies. And in fact, it may be even more important in some ways to empower them to be able to manage their physiological response and use helpful thoughts. And we'll talk more at the next session about that. We were able to successfully do this with kids with single words and phrase speech. And then the school-based project, we'll talk a little bit about that because it was inclusive of children with LD, ADHD, and language delays.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll move on. Yeah.
Great. Will part 2 be recorded and accessed at a later time? I believe so, because we're recording this one, it'll be posted. So I would imagine part 2, we will do the same. Can DBT and CBT work in tandem? So here's I'll take a stab at this. What I would say that to especially experienced mental health clinicians is, yeah, like you want to be able to use your tools that are that you know as good intervention, but to think about how you'd want to modify it for kids on the spectrum. Distress tolerance, is kind of a good kind of core concept that we think kind of cuts across some mindfulness sorts of things, and a kind of acceptance of distressing thoughts is something that we don't specifically write about, but we certainly do practically in some cases. What I would say to you is that we haven't studied it, so we don't have sort of research on it, but like any good clinician, you're going to look at what's available out there. You're going to try to put together programs that work for the kids and the families that you serve. So I would say use your good kind of clinical judgment about pairings of not just DBT and CBT, but sometimes people do ACT and CBT and other third wave kinds of approaches. So I would say use your judgment.
Yeah, I really like the concept of wise mind in DBT, and I feel like that really can be useful as we think about helpful thoughts as well. Ashley is saying a lot of the research is completed with high-functioning ASD. That's absolutely true. And we'll talk a little bit about further adaptations for kids with intellectual disability as well. That really is, that needs to be kind of the next wave. And we feel strongly that there are excellent ways to support people with intellectual disabilities. We talked a little bit about that already, but we'll talk more next time.
Someone has, and I'm looking at our time, and we're just,
okay.
One of the questions again was, are we adapting it for video delivery? The answer is yes, that it's been adapted. We're actually working on kind of a more updated guide for how to do telehealth delivery, and we know a number of groups around the country have been doing it via telehealth, including our own. And what we're going to do is talk about it next time. 'Cause I don't have enough time to go through all the adaptations. And I think somebody was asking about our contact info. I'm assuming you mean Audrey's and mine. So maybe what I'll do is share the screen for the first slide, and I'm thinking maybe we should sign off as I do that. Does that sound right? Okay, let me get to the share so that you can see our contact info. And feel free to reach out to us. I mean, I feel like we do get many questions about facing your fears, and it'll be on you can also search our names at the JFK website too, but those are our emails. We're happy to answer whatever questions you have, and hopefully we'll see some folks in 2 weeks and be able to talk more about this. All right. Thank you, everybody. And we appreciate everybody's attention and really great questions. So do we have the go ahead to sign off from Christine? Should we sign off?
I'm going to go ahead and sign us off. Thank you, Judy and Audrey. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye, everybody.